Welcome back to the Corner Faster, Get Fast series. We're in the Porsche Cayman GT4 at Watkins Glen using the iRacing simulator to take 50 laps and get up to speed in preparation for our Champ Car race later this month. This video is all about working out our brake points at Watkins Glen at the end of the long straightaways and the beginning of the long brake zones. Previously, we spent some time learning the layout, looking ahead, finding the min speeds, driving at the limit, and we took a deep look at curbing in and out of each corner. Now it's time that we're carrying a bit of momentum to start working out the finer points of our inputs, beginning with braking, specifically how we get on the brake to slow down the car as efficiently as possible. And there's a few aspects to the technique of getting on the brakes. It helps to break down our pedal application technique into a few phases. The first phase, taking any slack out of the system and really just applying the very beginning of braking force at all. We want that to be smooth and controlled so that if there is any slack out of the system, we don't just blow through that and have a sort of uncontrolled, peaky initial input, but instead we want that to be deliberate and controlled. And then we want to increase pedal pressure, reaching max pedal pressure progressively and in time with weight shifting. We don't want to ask too much of the tires at any point in time during the brake zone, instead waiting for that weight to shift and settle forward before asking maximum level of braking grip out of the tires. And then finally, there is that threshold maximum phase of braking. And we're basically just trying to hang on to that limit, making adjustments in the pedal for any changes in the surface, especially changes in elevation as brake zones either go uphill or downhill approaching the corner. So let's take a look at that at each brake zone around Watkins Glen. Everyone's a little bit different. So first of all, coming into turn one, you can see it starts to go downhill and then really pitches downhill as we get close to the corner. So that means that whatever threshold brake we get to, we're going to have to ease off the pedal a little bit as that track goes downhill to maintain the same level of grip, essentially, or the same level of traction, I should say. And then finally, we get down to the trail braking phase, which we'll visit in detail in the next video. But anyway, coming to turn one, we can get on the pedal pretty quickly, given that even though it's slightly downhill, but it's relatively flat, right around the 300 when we first get on the pedal. But then by the time we get close to the 100, it starts to go downhill a little bit, and that's when we have to start easing out of it before turning in. Coming into the bus stop, the brake zone is slightly uphill, pretty consistent grade uphill all the way, so braking right around this white line here is usually what we're aiming for. But we only reach about half pedal pressure because we're turning in pretty much right away into that first set of curbs. Into turn 6, this is a downhill brake zone that then gets even steeper. The deeper you get into the brake zone, so threshold braking here is not going to be with quite as high of a pedal input. You can see it's just very briefly that we're at threshold brake and it's not as much pedal pressure as, say, turn 1, and then quickly bleeding off as the track falls downhill. Into the toe, it actually goes uphill. So once we get into the pedal pressure, we can really lean into it as we get into this hill, probably the highest amount of pedal pressure on the whole track. And then we ease out of it very quickly as we begin a long trail brake again, which we'll take a look at in detail in the next video. Coming into the heel, it's slightly downhill as we go flying over the peak of the sole here, and then it gets slightly steeper downhill as we get closer. So using quite a bit of brake force in a straight line and then easing off slightly and then more and more and more as we head into the corner itself. So looking at that one more time, easing off the pressure as the track starts to fall away, and then very quickly out of the pressure. Coming into the off-camber corner, we do have a hill that we can brake into, but we can't get the pedal down quite so far because it's a very short braking period before it's time to get out of the pedal and start our trail brake. Just into the pedal briefly, and then almost as soon as we're at threshold, we begin to start bleeding out some of that pedal pressure. And now we come to the final brake zone, turn 11, just a little bit of braking, and we really don't want to even reach any more than 50% brake force as to keep that car balanced, but beginning just before the end of those tires. And then again, this is another brake zone where the track starts to fall down and into the corner just a little bit at the end of it. So we're going to have to ease off the pedal pressure even before we trail brake, easing off a little bit and then beginning our trail brake phase with almost no trail brake at all, and a very short one at that too. So there we have the nuances of threshold braking, as well as the techniques of threshold braking in each corner at Watkins Glen. Now, before we head out on track for the demonstration of the exercise to find the brake point, we're going to map out a rough baseline starting point for brake markers at each of the major brake zones around the track. Starting with turn 1, we've got the 300 board. Coming into the S's, we have that white line that's about 325. We've got the red Motul board going down into turn 6. We've got the 200 board, or really a little bit past the 200 board, into turn 7. We've got right at the 200 board for turn 8, just as the track goes uphill for turn 9, and then just before the end of those blue tires on the left for turn 11. So now that we've established a baseline breakpoint for each corner around the track, we're going to head out for a 10-lap exercise where we dial in our breakpoint. Each time we head around track, we want to brake at that designated reference point, starting out on the earlier side of that. So braking just before the 300 for turn 1, just before that white line for the S's, and so on around the track. And we want to see if, really we want to prove to ourselves that that is a little bit too early by turning in all the way to the inside of the apex, maybe getting to the inside of an apex curb where we shouldn't even be on it, but continuing to turn the car to the inside and prove to ourselves that there's more grip in the car. And then lap after lap, we want to brake a little later and a little later until we can no longer do that. When we slow down as efficiently as possible and turn in, we're just making the apex. And then we want to keep braking later and later and later until we can no longer make the apex. We don't want to spin out or crash or go sliding for car lengths and car lanes way offline, but we want to indicate in some way, either by just missing the apex or by scrubbing our exit or having to get out of the pedal, that we've gone a bit too far. And then once we've gone a little bit too shallow and a little bit too deep, we're going to try to dial in our Goldilocks breakpoints for each corner around the track. So let's head out on track, and here's a demonstration lap of braking just a little bit too early. So you can notice the brake lights and where we're just getting on the brakes a little bit before the 300 and then crashing into the apex curb there into turn 1. Had I braked a little bit later, I would not have been able to even get to that part of the apex curve, and it actually would have been a pretty decent run through that corner. So that was definitely a bit too early on that lap. Braking a little bit too early into the bus stop, it's a little too easy to get the car back to the left. If you find there's a little bit of a dead spot in the middle of the bus stop, that's a good indication you might be able to brake a little later. But again, this phase of braking too early is just to give ourselves the confidence in these reference points. Braking right at that motel sign gives me more than enough time to turn all the way into turn 6 and turn too far into turn 6, meaning I can probably go just a little later. Braking right at that 200 into the toe. Pretty easy to get the car slowed down. I'm right off the brakes, not really needing that much trail brake, and still hitting the grass on the inside. Coming into the heel, if we brake pretty much right at the 200 here, that gives us more than enough time to slow down a little too much again and get all the way to the grass on the inside. Right at the bottom of the hill at the off camber, just a little bit too early there, getting onto the apex curb and getting pushed out a little more aggressively than I would have wanted towards the exit. And now finally we've got turn 11, getting the car slowed down maybe a little too much there, a little too easy to get onto that apex curb. So that was a pretty unimpressive lap on purpose, braking too early and turning in. Why? To prove that if we rely on the brake points and brake a little on the earlier side of each of those brake markers where we've been braking so far, that we'll have more than enough time to get the car slowed down and turned in. So after a few laps of that, we want to start pushing those brake zones deeper and deeper until the car no longer sticks. So we'll take a look now at lap 6, where we've been pushing maybe a foot or two deeper lap after lap, and now we're way too deep, going well past the 300 into turn 1, and you can see you can't quite make it down to the apex and go long on exit, both indicators that didn't get the car slowed down enough. So we're still using the reference markers, just this time braking a little bit past them as opposed to a little bit before them, to prove, one, that they're in the right ballpark, and two, to really find the extreme latest point where if we get on the brake pedal at that point, no matter what we do, we can't quite get the car slowed down enough for the corner. It's also important as we brake later that we still rely on proper brake technique, not pressing that pedal too quickly in order to most efficiently slow down the car. But here we are flying into the boot, now missing pretty much every apex on track just by a little bit, braking just a little too late, maybe half a car length, maybe a couple feet too late into each brake zone. I think this lap was about half a second off of the ideal lap, so overdriving is typically not quite as bad of a mistake as underdriving on any single lap, but this would definitely add up and lead to quite a roasted tire after a pretty short amount of time trying to make all these corners work with these super late brake zones. So as we head out onto the front straight, after missing and actually bonking off the wall there, pretty much blowing slightly every single brake zone on the track, it's time for the last few laps of the exercise where we start to dial in those brake points and try to hit them on the money. So jumping up now to lap 10, you can see we're going to split the difference on those brake points pretty much right as we go past the 300. And that leads to right on the money for the apex and a decent exit for turn 1. Having gone a little too early and a little too late, going right down the middle, splitting the difference is the name of the game for these last few laps here of finding our break point. When I was pushing it too deep, it was just barely too deep, so I'm only backing off a little bit from there in order to make the bus stop. Although I probably want to back off maybe even just a little earlier from there, but not too much. Coming to turn 6, paying attention to that motel sign, flying by. Pretty much right as we're flying by is a decent spot to get that car slowed and then turned in. Maybe a car length after the 200 and back on the brakes for the toe. That leads to getting just barely into the yellow line for an ideal apex up the hill. Coming into the heel, want to brake pretty much right as we're flying by that 200 marker. Again, pretty much right down to the line. Right into the bottom of the pitch of the hill for turn 9 seems to be a good point to get on the brakes. And it's mostly by feel here in turn 11, but definitely into the pedal before the end of the tires on the left there. Helps get the car lined up for the right trajectory onto the straightaway. So there you have it, a 10-lap exercise to help dial in the brake point. It starts by figuring out what the brake zones look like for each corner around the track and really coming up with the best technique to maintain threshold brake as the track changes underneath in each of those brake zones. Also need to be mindful of each phase of pedal application and don't overly rush any of them, getting the full brake power and full brake pedal input. And then when we actually head out on track for the exercise, working with those reference points that we map out in advance and making small adjustments, braking a little before or a little after to continue to build confidence and consistency in getting on the brake in each of the long brake zones here at Watkins. That's it for now. Stick around for the next video where we focus on getting off the brake pedal to turn the car. Thanks for watching.